Hi, I'm Sharon Weinstein, and the topic for today's session is innovations in leadership. We'll be looking at visionary leadership and how critical it is during a crisis as global and systemic as this one. Leaders in all areas of healthcare have experienced disruption. Transformational leaders have taken innovative steps towards surviving and thriving in today's next normal. In this session, our panelists discuss planning for the future, restructuring the learning system, and innovating for optimum patient experience. Given the magnitude of the shock and the challenges that this crisis represents, leaders must consider the full breadth of their employees' needs as people. Safety is essential, of course, but it's also important to address higher level needs, such as the one for truth, stability, connections, self-esteem, growth, and meaning. Many leaders speak of the pandemic in terms of three phases. The first is shelter in place, the second is reopening, and the third is post-COVID, assuming that we are going to see and experience a post-COVID. We'll be dealing with some of the strategic issues today and how we can create moments that matter, that will sustain us throughout our respective futures and allow those we lead to be empowered, to feel engaged, and to be respected. Let me introduce our esteemed panel. First, we have Dr. Margaret Fitzgerald. Margaret will be talking about the leadership impact planning for the future. She's an experienced clinician, successful entrepreneur, award-winning author, a renowned speaker. She is also founder of and principal speaker at Fitzgerald Health Education Associates, a leading national provider of nurse practitioner certification prep and continuing education. Welcome, Margaret. Next, we have Melissa Burdi, Academic Dean and Vice President of the School of Nursing at Purdue University Global. Melissa will be addressing restructuring the learning system. She has provided senior level leadership in the academic arena, leading both DNP and RN-BSN programs. Her expertise is in leadership development, nursing mentorship, and process improvement. And finally, Kristin Baird, founder and president of the Baird Group, who will be talking about being the leader nobody wants to leave. Kristin is a thought leader in healthcare for her work in patient experience, culture enhancement, and leadership development. As a culture catalyst, she has a passion for bringing out the best in both individuals and organizations. In 2009, she received an appointment by the Secretary of Health to serve as an advisor to the National Health Service Corps. And when it comes to promoting a culture of excellence in healthcare, she wrote the book. Literally, she wrote the book, Consumer Service in Healthcare, followed by Raising the Bar on Service Excellence. Welcome to our panel. I'm really delighted to have you with us today. Let's begin with Dr. Margaret Fitzgerald. Please share with us your perspective.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this important panel. I speak from the viewpoint of an entrepreneur, business owner, and also a practicing nurse practitioner in a federally qualified health center. And I've been both challenged and privileged in this past 8 months since we went to the era of COVID-19 in the United States, to be leading a group of people within my company, but also being a frontline family nurse practitioner in seeing patients with COVID-19 and appreciating the impact of this tremendous insult to the health of our nation. So first of all, what I want to do, though, is think for a moment, what is innovation? And remember, it's executing an idea which addresses a specific challenge and achieves value for the customer, consumer, and or organization. What did we need to do as a company that is focused on both continuing education for healthcare provider, but also helping nurse practitioners achieve certification? What we needed to do was, the word pivot keeps coming up, but pivoting towards our older model of providing services to what we're doing now. Thankfully, we had been anticipating a switch to predominantly online learning, and that really facilitated things. But what we were going to do in 6 months, we did in 10 days.
Wow.
10 days, less than 2 weeks. We also needed to serve a population of people in the healthcare industry who were at risk for picking up this disease while on the job, who had lost clinical placements because of because of COVID-19 for the NP students. And what we needed to do was bring along all of our staff, 25 speakers, to be able to deal with a particularly sensitive and, at times, to be honest with you, nerve raw customer base. We also needed to do this while achieving value, because what customers were expecting were one product, like particularly in-person online learning, in-person learning. And now what they were being given was a totally different product. What allowed that to happen? Part of this was teamwork. The other part was utter transparency as to how painful the process would be at times. And another part that came along was empowering staff to speak to me and the other leadership in the company and say, I don't believe that's the way we should do this. And by taking comments like that very, very seriously. What does that mean to us going forward now? We're taking the lessons that we have learned from this incredibly difficult time, applying it to what we're doing in our long-range plan, which long-range planning for us has gone from 5 years down to 1.5 years, or what will be the true in the trenches COVID era. The end product is we've been very successful with this transition. We've expanded product lines. We've met the customer. We've met the consumer where they are. Our university product line has exploded over the last few months, and we're very pleased with where we are. We're also very humbled by where we are.
Wow, thank you, Margaret, for sharing the story of your pivot. It certainly is transformational, especially when you talk about value and expectations. Melissa, I'd like to turn to you and ask you about restructuring the learning system. What has been the impact where you're concerned?
Thanks, Sharon. Well, as we know, innovation is the key to building the future of tomorrow. And without innovation, an organization loses their ability to maintain competitive advantage, and the product or service they have to offer, as Dr. Fitzgerald just pointed out, runs the risk of losing its value over time. So with that, I believe that it's paramount that organizations factor innovation into their strategic planning and think ahead, remembering that today's successes are a product of yesterday's planning. And we do this in 3 ways. Establishing criteria for vetting innovative concepts, creating a diverse think tank in your organization, and dedicating space for brainstorming of new ideas. As we look to incorporate innovation into our strategic plan, we need to be asking ourselves as leaders these very important questions. Will it add value to the organization? What's missing from your current portfolio? Does it align with the mission, the vision, the values? Will it transform or enhance workflow efficiency? Will it differentiate you from your competition in the market? How will you solicit input from your teams? Is there a positive return on investment? How long will it take to achieve that ROI? And the last but most important question is here, what are you solving for? What is the problem is that you are trying to solve for? And I think that these are all great questions as a leader in an organization that we need to be asking ourselves and our teams as we think about restructuring the learning system. In fact, I think it's important as leaders that we hold strategic planning sessions multiple times each year. It's never a one and done. And this signifies to your team that you are creating intentional space for brainstorming and that you want to be very deliberate about doing this. You want your teams to feel and understand the importance of it. You're doing it with them and you're doing it by design. When you're brainstorming, I think what I've seen is that it's very important you avoid going into solution mode, that you're dedicating time to putting all ideas on virtual whiteboards. No idea should ever be discounted. And when the team has exhausted all of their efforts, all of their brainstorming power, that's when you can aggregate all of these ideas together by theme. And you use those lists of questions that I just went through that help you to really determine if any of these emerging themes are meet the criteria for you to forge ahead strategically. And then dedicating space in your plan or your vision for innovation and not being afraid to share with others. I believe if you're truly an innovator, why not lead by example and share the benefits from your playbook with other departments, other teams, other organizations? The reality is that you shouldn't be afraid of competition, as we'll likely be past the initiative and on to the next innovation. So very, very important to allow others to benefit from your work to improve the greater good. And last, I'll just share, given the current state of affairs and the pandemic, I reflect often on COVID-19 and all of the change and innovation that has taken place as a result of the times that we're in. We've all been pushed to transform our operations from face-to-face to virtual, including academia. And many industries are having to reimagine their workflow, their product, their work culture. Some industries will never be the same, and sadly, some jobs will cease to exist moving forward. And this has certainly changed our economy, our ecosystem in significant ways. But remember though, through establishing meaningful criteria to vet your innovative concepts, being intentional and creating a platform for brainstorming with your teams and building space in your vision and in your budget for innovation, this really helps organizations to remain ahead.
Thank you so much for that. That's a truly important perspective, especially when you think about not reinventing the wheel. In an organization such as yours, there are so many academic departments, and a lot of what one organization or one unit develops can easily be transferred within the others without having to redo every single thing. So I think that was also an important perspective. Let's hear now from Kristin.
Yes, you just building off things that Margaret and Melissa have said, really spurred a lot of thinking. Like Margaret, I come at this as an entrepreneur and coach, and really we've had to pivot as well so that we could continue serving our customers from coast to coast. And one of the things that we had begun prior to the pandemic was bringing a lot of our workshops and courses and trainings online. So similar to Margaret, we have been doing the same thing, but one of the things we've layered onto that is our coaching, because we know from all of the work that we do internally with organizations, with helping them change their culture, you still need, beyond the training, you need that one-on-one coaching for the leaders. And as I look at patient experience during the pandemic, I've interviewed a lot of CXOs out there to find out, what is top of mind for them? What are the big barriers? What is keeping them awake at night? And honestly, it comes down to necessity is the mother of invention. And we see that a lot, that people have had to be really, really creative. And what I see as the real blessing in the pandemic is that necessity to be creative and to pivot on a dime. We are in an industry that is so risk averse that when we start to talk about innovation, people get scared. When you're trying to innovate, you're not going to have a litany of data that shows, I'm convinced this will work and here's the proof. That's what innovation is. And so getting people on the same page and being ready to make that pivot in an area that is so unknown and uncharted territory, that to me has been the blessing of COVID, because as I interview CNOs and CXOs, I'm hearing a real similar theme, and that is we have been able to change faster than we ever dreamed possible, and that they were forced into it, right? We don't wish a pandemic on anyone, and yet what I'm hearing is, now we know we can change. And I'm hearing others say, how can we carry this forward? How can we carry this mindset forward as we adapt to what we hope will soon be post-pandemic. But that's where I see the real blessing, and I come at it with a combination of the patient experience and the culture work that we do. And the real combination has been that when you look at patient satisfaction and patient engagement, you can't have that without a rock solid, engaged team. And you're not going to have an engaged team unless you have really good leadership. And unfortunately, we are still having the same discussions today that we did 30 and 40 years ago, that many of our leaders have been promoted from within because of their great clinical skills. And so we have to be able to innovate how we train our leaders, how we continue to coach our leaders on the front lines, because they are the ones that are going to determine the level of staff engagement and therefore patient satisfaction. So, how do we help shape the leaders that nobody wants to leave? All of this comes together, and it's time for us to really step back, take a quick look, and innovate.
Great. You touched on some interesting concepts as well. First of all, think about this. We are all from a clinical nursing background. We have mastered innovation over and over and over again. We have been able to pivot on a dime because often individuals' lives were at stake if we didn't have the wherewithal to get up and do that. So when you start to think about where we've been and what we've done in our professional careers, we are uniquely set for this type of a challenge.
Exactly. And Sharon, if I could bounce off of that real quickly, I heard a statistic the other day that I found phenomenal. And they said that the average nurse does approximately 28 workarounds every shift. So you stop and think, just like you said, Sharon, that's innovation. That's innovation on our feet in real time.
It is. It's thinking in real time, it's acting in real time, and it's creating positive outcomes as a result of that, also in real time for the long haul. And that's what's most important. So we've touched on some really interesting topics between the three of you. You make a great panel, but I want to ask you, Melissa, what if the pandemic were over tomorrow? How would that change? How would that change significantly? Perhaps that strategic plan that we're looking at a shorter time frame. What if it were over tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Sharon. I would say consider what we've learned from the pandemic. As important as it is to look ahead, it's equally important to look back and learn from lessons that we've gone through. So looking ahead, what does the current supply and demand look like? Consider the voice of the customer. What are they looking for? And then be able to build from there. I think the landscape has changed. It's changing actively. And will change some more, I think, before the pandemic is over. So there will be a lot of evaluation that needs to take place as we consider what the new normal looks like.
Okay, and Margaret, if you would for a minute, you talked a little bit about the value and the expectations of the consumer, of the customer. What would they expect if the pandemic were to end tomorrow? Would they expect you to go back to what used to be normal and pick it up from there? Or to move in a different direction, or to continue with what you're doing now?
That's an interesting question, because we are already surveying our customer base to see what their expectations are. And so that as we move forward, we'll have a better idea how to, quite frankly, allocate resources. We don't want to be doing a lot of in-person programs when people are not ready to go to in-person programs, when it is safe to do in-person programs. That's a number of months, if not a full year off. What will end up happening is we will continue to move to make the live stream experience far more like the in-person experience, with having the ability to consult with a faculty member in real time, to be able to network even though you are live stream. And then when we are at a point of being able to move more towards in-person, will maximize what is most helpful to present in person and likely do a lot more hybrid learning. And if I can kind of add a thought onto that, one part, we've talked about innovation, we've talked about leadership. In this time of crisis, which is something I believe everyone in this panel today needs to think of, many people in healthcare who had not thought of themselves as ever desiring to be a leader in a leadership position have stepped up and become new leaders as the enormity of what has happened really unfolded. We have a sacred obligation to foster the continued leadership, to foster the continued innovation in these budding leaders. And I don't want to lose track of that in our discussion.
And we want to keep them engaged. So Kristin, would you touch on how does culture determine engagement, service, and retention? We want to keep these new leaders.
Yeah, exactly. We want to keep the new leaders. And Margaret, you said that so well, that this really is a sacred opportunity for us. And we'd be remiss to shut the door behind us and say it's over, when in fact it's just beginning. The real opportunities are just beginning. And you're right, people have stepped up like never before. And so, like I said earlier, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting new, different results, right? And yet here we are in 2020 promoting somebody from within who may be a fantastic clinician and yet doesn't have the first clue about how to be a leader. And so we've got to be able to support them with real skills, with transformational leadership development, so that they can learn a skill, apply a skill, get coached on a skill. And I think that for me is the real shift that we've got to see, because when I look at how learning occurs in a lot of leadership education, it's read this book, watch this video, take this quiz, whether it's in person or virtual, or go to a conference. People come back all excited. They've got all these notes and handouts and slides, and they're really excited. And then life gets in the way. So how do you shift that? For me to really shift that, changing the culture starts with the leaders. And if we really want the leaders to change, we've got to change how we develop them. So yes, you need the skill development. Yes, you need the cognitive piece of this, but you also have to have the application process where they're applying the skills and then getting feedback from a good coach who can help walk them through what went well, what didn't go well. How can I support you? What questions do you have? Those are the things that are going to help the person really grow. And that is where I see a lot of it is missing. We want to develop these leaders. We want to get back to the human element. When we think about developing the leaders so that they can improve the patient experience, there has to be accountability. But even before accountability, I'm very passionate about people who choose healthcare. They choose healthcare because they want to make a difference, right? And then they get to their shift and they've got a list of tasks to accomplish. One of the things leaders must become proficient at is helping each individual connect to purpose. Because when they have a strong connection to purpose, their head is involved, their heart is involved, and it makes them stronger and more empathetic, more compassionate for their patients. You don't want them all feeling. You've got to have the intellectual part, you've got to have the heart part, but it all comes together. We talk about head, heart, and hands. You have to have the cognitive ability. You have to have the empathy and compassion, but you got to have the skills, so they all have to go hand in hand. And so we need to really work on transforming how leaders are groomed. And it's not a one and done thing. It's a lifelong learning process. You know, coaches are made, they're not born. And every leader needs to have coaching skills. So, you know, that's kind of a long-winded answer, Sharon, to your question. Did I hit on what you wanted me to?
You did. It sounded very much like the book, The Oz Principle. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's an amazing book. It's used a lot in transformational coaching. I've used it a lot abroad with foreign nursing audiences, and it truly, especially when you're doing role play, allows one to assume that individual role, because we also need leaders. And this is what I think each of you touched on, leaders who can demonstrate vulnerability and empathy. And it's really interesting to observe for us that so many countries that seem to be going through this crisis the most effectively, like Germany, Taiwan, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Denmark, are all women-led countries. And that their leaders seem to combine a science-based approach that has a human touch. So brainstorming for a moment, quick answer, please. How do we create moments that matter, that will sustain us throughout our respective futures and allow those we lead to feel empowered, to be respected? How do we do that, Melissa?
I think it's all about connecting with the individual, leading with empathy, as Kristin just shared. That's key. When we can connect with individuals and really understand what motivates them, what motivates groups collectively, that really is very instrumental in creating change.
Okay, and what would you add to that, Margaret?
What I would add to that, and I love the whole concept of the connection. And I was speaking of human connection, the other day, I almost accidentally hugged a neighbor. I started walking towards her. We were about 10 feet apart, and I went, no, we do not hug these days. And so I am one of those people that so craves being physically in the presence of other people, which of course has been very difficult. But what I also think about is all of us who are currently in leadership positions need to keep that in mind, that human touch. Also to remember, this is the time for us to demonstrate what innovation-led leadership is, because this is going to require us as leaders to show the budding leaders coming along. We're unrestrained by the past. We're not doing this and saying, well, that's the way we've always done it. No. We're forward driven. We have to demonstrate that we're embracing ambiguity in the time of crisis, but still with an eye on what will be safe and what will be most effective. We also have to embrace holding multiple possibilities, and to be able to say, to listen to the input of the people around us and say, yes, that is possible. This will be possible at a later date, and prioritize possibilities. And one more time, it's been said a few times already, we have all been, I still am, in clinical practice. This is a direct extension of our clinical practice. And what we have to demonstrate to the people who are clinicians who are new to leadership is how much their clinical assessment skills will serve them very, very well in their leadership, their leadership position.
Exactly. And you focused a lot on the concept of possibility. What if, just what if, a vaccine were available tomorrow? Kristin, would that change your perspective at all?
Not much. You know, if a vaccine were available tomorrow, I still think that what I would want to see in innovation, you know, continue. That, you know, we don't want to go backwards. Like Margaret said, we're not looking behind us anymore. We're looking ahead. And as I said earlier, the necessity has been the mother of invention as we've moved through this, and we've had to be lithe and lean and quick on our feet. And hopefully we will be able to carry that with us. And part of it is, you know, I want people to stay focused on connecting the people back to the real mission, vision, and values of the organization. You know, whether there's a vaccine or not, today, wherever we are, we must remain connected. And that's how we're going to connect people back to their individual sense of purpose and the purpose they serve for the greater good, you know, for the organization.
Okay, how about you, Melissa? What if there were a vaccine tomorrow? How would that impact Purdue University Global?
You know, I think it's really an important time. It's a great question to reevaluate the landscape of our current state of affairs, and including the healthcare, the academic delivery models, and identify ways that we can capitalize on opportunities that have emerged as a result of COVID. I think in terms of the pandemic itself, we need to respond cautiously. We need to allow the vaccine time to demonstrate its efficacy and ensure that we remain protected. But we need to also remember the measures that we've put into place to mitigate COVID-19 and continue to exercise those measures. But really focus on the future and look ahead to innovation. And I love what you said earlier, both you and Margaret, and you had mentioned embracing as leaders this ambiguous period of time. And I would just echo that and say that it's about leading with courage in addition to leading with empathy.
Right. Exactly. And Margaret, what about you? What if there were a vaccine tomorrow? Do your patients now ask that question?
Oh, my patients ask that constantly, as do all my friends, and I swear everybody I know. I've spoken now to about 20,000 people specifically on COVID-19, in part reflecting on my experiences of a frontline clinician in a community that has been a COVID-19 hotspot for, it was in March, and we're now back almost, not to where we were in March and April, but we're climbing. It's very, very worrisome. Now I'm going to have to go all science on you here, but it's estimated that 320 million people in the United States would need that vaccine. The vaccine will likely be a 2-dose vaccine. So take 320 multiplied by 2, we're up to 640 million doses will need to be given. And if we're really fortunate, the vaccine will be about 75% effective. And then another confounding variable is 1/3 of the population already says they won't take the vaccine. So now do this. Is COVID-19, even if there was a vaccine tomorrow, is it going away tomorrow? No, the impact of the vaccine will likely be 2 to 3 years out, 2 to 3 years out. So as has been said, we are going to still need to alter our day-to-day behavior from what the world as we knew it before mid-March 2020 in the United States. And so it will take, I believe, then a mindset of a few more years beyond that as we emerge from the era of COVID-19, not the time of COVID-19 or the season of COVID-19, but what we will do is we'll call it the era of COVID-19. I'll throw in one other. We don't see measles because we have a dynamite vaccine. We don't see people dying of HIV as they once did. We don't have a vaccine, but we have amazing medications. We need the combination of those two things, an amazing vaccine and great meds if people do get sick. We do not have either of those right now.
Those were some great points that you made, and I'm glad that you talked about the concept of an era. So it's time for us to close out. We've had great content here. I'm going to ask each of you to give me one last thought, a quick thought. I know that each of you has much to say and you're all so engaging and so talented and so bright, but if you would please just give us one last thought with respect to what does the audience need to know? What do they need to know to prepare for next steps? Give it your best shot. Melissa?
Thanks, Sharon. Think differently, think big, right? Never be afraid to think of what could exist, what might exist. We've heard a lot today about what we have attempted to do over the last 20 years, and we've not yet been successful. Continue to be innovative in your thinking, and don't let the past deter you from the future. Instead of considering all of the obstacles that are in the way, think of what might exist and what things you might need to put into place so that that innovation can in fact come to life. Use opportunities such as this uncharted pandemic, COVID-19, to serve as your catalyst for many of the initiatives that might be in your pipeline. Think about how you can transform activities, ways of operating that traditionally are in a face-to-face setting, moving those to virtual settings, and how you might be able to respond with virtual agility. So think big and think differently, and don't be afraid.
Thank you. Kristin, do you want to touch on that? What takeaway thought do you have for our audience?
Just to really embrace innovation as we look forward, not to be afraid. Let's take that risk-averse industry that we've been in and say we're in a new era. We're in the COVID era, or emerging from, and it's time to really embrace innovation in a new way. And that look at all of the ideas. You know, the people in the trenches, the people that are closest to the work, they have a lot to contribute. Innovation can't be top down. And to really be innovative, you have to create a culture that embraces new ideas, who can stand up, a culture that will stand up to the naysayers, the resistors. And until you have senior executive leadership who says, this is a safe place to innovate, that we know that we're going to have failures and we will embrace those failures and learn, but we will not, be blaming. We'll be a blame-free organization. So it really takes a whole culture to embrace innovation moving forward.
Great. Okay. And do you want to close that thought out, Margaret?
Yes. And what I'd like to do is speak directly to the nurse who thinks of him or herself as a clinician first, and not necessarily, if you will, leadership material. Remember, leadership starts with you. Take your passion, your intelligence, your incredible skill at assessment, diagnosis, intervention, evaluation, and think of yourself as that clinical leader. Define leadership more broadly than I want to be a CNO or something along those lines. And remember that you can make your mark as that clinical leader and perhaps expand that into a role in leadership that currently does not exist. Now is the time to do this. There is a corollary between crisis and opportunity, and the two exist on the same plane. We are in crisis. We are also in a time of great opportunity.
I love that perspective. I worked in the past for an organization that said that there are no challenges, only opportunities. And if we looked at each and every one of those challenges as an opportunity to think bigger, to give voice, to have a bigger picture, to be a visionary leader, to be transformational, and to really adopt the changes that we need to do, both internally and externally, in order to provide the very best service, the very best quality, true deliverables, and see people where they are so that we can empathize with them. We can understand where they're coming from. We can do what we need to do as leaders to create the cadre of leaders for our future, because we'll be recipients of care in that future, and we want it to be the very best that it possibly can be. So I want to thank each of you, Kristin Baird, Melissa Burdi, and Margaret Fitzgerald, for joining me today for this incredible session Your insight, your input has been invaluable in terms of really providing great content for our program.